All right. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening. Moweni, Salborna, depending on when and where you happen to be listening or watching us. And welcome to the third and final of the Access Habitable Planet Online Course 2017 live streamed events. This is our last Hangout with a scientist for 2017, and it also promises to be one of the most exciting ones because, as you remember in our course so far, we started what seems like a lifetime ago, back nearly 9 weeks ago, when we started off with our question as to why is it that Earth is the only habitable planet in the entire universe that we know. You remember that there was this very, very handsome English scientist who came on and gave you this lecture about the Big Bang and the solar system and how all of that came together, and then made this observation that we now know around 10,000 planets in the universe, but only one of them is known to be habitable. And that's the one that we're on. And since then, we've spent a very, very exciting 9 weeks trying to investigate scientifically why it is that that might be. Why is it? What's so special about this planet? And you remember we started off with simple physics, right? It was Sarisha who gave the talk Not Too Hot all that time ago, where she said, well, look, you know, maybe Mars is too cold and Venus is too hot. Earth is just the right temperature. So maybe we're just the right distance from the sun. And then it turns out that when Sarisha ran a simple model with just physics, no atmosphere, no ocean, no biology, no people, that the planet was far too cold for life. And so ever since then, we've been slowly adding in pieces of the model. We added in all the physics, and we got a purely physical model of how the Earth works. And then we moved on to the biology and chemistry, and we made this really astounding discovery that we can't actually explain why Earth is habitable without life itself. And then we got to the end of section 2, and we've got this a biological, chemical, and physical model of how the Earth works. We've had to abandon very, very simple physics, and in abandoning simple physics, we had to get rid of just simple numerical models. Once you got onto climate, we actually need to deal with vast numerical models, some of which need massive amounts of parameterization. That's, as we learned, is a word for the types of assumptions about the average effect of things. But when we bring in life, we get to the point where we can't run numerical models anymore. We can't really numerically model every single cell in a living organism. So things got very, very complicated. And to try and understand it, biologists use a lot of statistical models. We know that most birds migrate along a certain track. We can't predict the behavior of every bird, but we can do some sort of statistical analysis to show that's where birds are likely to go. So I started that very long sentence by saying this is going to be the most interesting of the online events. And the reason being that in this last section, we've introduced humans. And humans are massively more complicated than even all of those organisms that we put in, because humans are thinking, intelligent beings with emotions, with political views, with unconscious bias. We get into a whole range of very, very complicated issues, which we're so far away now from that lovely simple physics we started with. And it becomes a very, very difficult area to engage with, because we're all humans ourselves, and each and every one of us comes with our own background, our own culture, and also our own set of unconscious bias. So in order to try and investigate the topic of humans, we actually somehow have to deal with the fact that we're a human trying to investigate humans, and that becomes exceptionally difficult. We've left behind any sort of mathematical models now, and we have to deal with conceptual models. And examples are, for example, if we're looking at how to run a human society, communism and capitalism are conceptual models. They are ways that people try and engage with how is it best for humans to act. And as I say, for me as a scientist, it becomes very, very difficult. And I find the simple physics much easier, but I know lots of people absolutely love the challenge of bringing in humans, and so that's what we're going to do for the next, hopefully, 90 minutes or so today. I want to just say a couple of things before I introduce our wonderful panel to you. The first is that, once again, as I've pointed out to you several times, I am originally from England. I really apologize if I murder your names, but I am equal opportunities when it comes to murdering names. Whether they're Afrikaans, African or Indian, I mispronounce them all, but I will do my utmost best. Secondly, I really want everyone to try and engage. This is a really fascinating topic. It's also a topic on which everybody can be an expert. You all know your own culture, you're all human. And so when we're talking about humans and climate change, what you say matters. And that actually was a big part of my lecture next week, the difference between science and ethical questions. So please, please get on the chat. I am watching there now. I see Esther, Sabaniso, and the wonderfully named Daddy K are all already on there. I'd encourage you to please all try and contribute. If you're watching in a big group, I'd like to ask the group leaders if you can ask around at points if people have questions. You can hopefully bring those questions and type them in for them. I'm also watching on Twitter. You can use the hashtag HPW25. Okay, so to help us try and make sense of this quite exciting and difficult topic, I've assembled a panel of expert access scientists who are going to help you. I'm going to go around and just ask each one of them to say a little bit about who they are, what their specialism is, and then, as always, I'm going to use one of your questions to help with the introduction. And the question comes from Anita Nyagule, who asks, what is science? And so I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just give a little bit about what that means to them. What does science mean to you? I'll start with in the room to me, so on my right. I'm left, they're right.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Riashna Sithaldeen, and I'm a scientist in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cape Town. And my particular speciality is understanding the biogeography of Southern African baboons. Now, the question, what is science to me? So I tried to frame this in terms of what a lot of the questions that were related to human evolution were about. And to me, science is about how the fact that humans have been curious about the world. We've always been curious about the world since the beginning of the technology as we know it. And we want to know about how things work and why. And one of the main reasons that we want to know is so that we can manipulate these things to our advantage, from the time we were using stone tools up until today, where we're doing all kinds of much more sophisticated things. And one of the ways in which we do that is we engage in cooperative behavior. So to me, science is a language that we can all speak to each other, where we all know what we mean when we say 1 + 1 = 2. So it's a common language that we use, and it's a language that is considered to be objective, and it's a language that we use to achieve a common goal, which is to understand the natural world. There are, of course, other ways to experience the world, but to me, science is about understanding it in an objective way.
Nice one. Thank you.
Hi, Planeteers. My name is Precious Mahlalela, and I'm a master's student at the University of Cape Town, and my research is basically on rainfall variability around South Africa. So what is science to me? I think science is just using observations, so having evidence and using it to try understand the world around us. And in achieving that, we use specific procedures, so like a systematic approach in actually using that evidence to understand the world around us. So if whatever argument that you have doesn't have evidence to back it up, and procedure that we can actually follow to actually understand how you came to your conclusions, that cannot be science. And going back to what Riashna has just said, it has to be objective. People have to be able to actually go back and challenge and go through what you have actually produced. And that's what science is about to me.
Nice one. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to KZN, where we have two panel members huddled in Dr. Kabir's office. I'm putting you guys up now. Don't forget to unmute your microphone.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Hi. So my name is Nawisa Mkhize, and I'm doing my master's in geography and environmental management. And my definition of science is quite simple. As a geographer, science to me sort of means trying to understand the world around us and how it works. And yeah, that's what science means to me.
Nice, good afternoon. I'm Kabir Peerbhay. I'm from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I work for the Institute of Commercial Forest Resources. I do the GIS and modeling. And we basically grow trees. So science to me is more about answering questions. I think curiosity, answering those questions with evidence. So you want to try and prove what you want to know, very simply put. Thank you.
Nice one. Thank you very much, Kabir. Let me just make sure we've got us back on screen. I'm aware that we have one more panel member who hasn't arrived yet, Hlengiwe. As and when she arrives, I will ask her to give a quick introduction to herself. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to plow into this section of the course. There's only a few lectures compared to the other sections of the course, but as I said, historically, they do tend to generate a lot more discussion than the other lectures, and none more so than the topic of human evolution. And so I'd firstly like Riashna can you just give us like a 2-minute feel of why is human evolution important in an Earth system science context?
Okay, so again, we want to understand, if we think about science as understanding how the world works and why it works the way it does, an understanding of human evolution is understanding how we work and why we work the way we do. So some of the things that we study in human evolution, everything from biomechanics, so the actual act of moving and how we move the way we do, to how we came to move the way we do. So the evolutionary stages that led up to that, it's all important for things like understanding our physical anatomy for medical reasons. It's important for understanding our place in the natural system. And it's important also for understanding how we go from being manipulated by environment to being manipulators of the environment as we move forward.
Sure, and it's a story in which climate plays a big role, right?
Yes and no. We used to think that climate was the most significant driver in some of the changes we see. We now know that it's a combination. Like you said, everything's complex, and humans are a complex system. And so we now know that with climate as maybe this overarching mechanism driving certain selection in humans, we also have other things that are playing a role, but we can talk about that a little bit later.
Okay, sure, great. Okay, so to dive into some of the questions, as I say, this is a section where you guys, the Habitable planets, them as possible. There's a couple, one which sort of just scrapes into human evolution. It's almost pre-human evolution, as you will find out, but I'm going to start there and work forward. And that's Brilliant Mashao asks, according to science, which gender came first and what influenced that? And that's a really interesting question, and I'll give a go to a start. Principally, one of the difficulties in answering that question is how do you define gender? And obviously, gender or sex, we use them interchangeably in science. They're used not interchangeably in a social context. You could sort of define, within humans, we tend to define gender as based on carrying the baby. But then within other animals, for example, seahorses, the males carry the baby, so that's not a clear-cut definition of gender. You could do it in terms of chromosomes, a genetic definition, XY, right? But actually birds don't use the XY system, and yet they have recognizable males and females. So that falls down. You could do it in terms of the types of gametes, sperm and egg, but obviously we have male and female outside the animal kingdom, and they don't necessarily have sperm and egg, and they don't necessarily have just male and female. There are types of fungi where there are thousands of genders, and each one has a specific role of other genders and specific way it interacts with the other genders. So it becomes, firstly, a very difficult question to establish what is it you mean by sex or gender when it comes to what was the first. But to answer, within the humans XY, my suggestion would be that females had to come first, because the Y chromosome is basically a faulty X chromosome. So to make a faulty X chromosome, you had to have the X chromosome there originally. So within the XXXY that we're used to, if that's your definition, then I would argue that women had to come first. However, it's important to say that there was sexual intercourse before that, there was sexual reproduction before that, and that there was different genders before that, just not in the way that we would recognize them now. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, just to add on to that, from a purely from a more sort of mechanistic, I guess, point of view, it's important to understand that evolution, if what you're referring to is what came first, the chicken or the egg kind of scenario, in terms of evolution, evolution doesn't happen in an individual. It happens in a population, and you're going to see a lot of variation within that population along these lines. So the emergence of that original male-female is nearly impossible to tie down sort of in terms of a falsifiable hypothesis. And it's very important to think about evolution as happening in average within a group, rather than as one individual suddenly started walking on 2 legs, for example.
That is a big thing that comes up quite a lot. Lots of students want to know, but who was the first one?
It wasn't, it doesn't have a name. On that point, someone asked about Eve, and whether, given that Eve is the first woman in the Bible and Eve is a fossil that was named, just to clarify, the fossil was named after the individual in the Bible. That was poetic license. It wasn't didn't actually have a name.
That's mitochondrial Eve.
Yes, there's mitochondrial Eve, and there are Eve's footprints in Langebaan.
Okay, maybe we'll come to that.
Yes.
Okay, very quickly, I think, Sipo Wokushle Buthelezi asks, where exactly did humans evolve? And I'm going to defer to you a little bit, but I mean, the fundamental answer, I think, is that we don't know, but somewhere in Africa. Somewhere in Africa. So again, what's important to recognize with science, we can only make conclusions based on the evidence that we have. And it is very likely that there is some evidence that we don't have. But based on the evidence that we have today, the oldest fossils of bipedal apes are in Africa, and the oldest fossils of Homo erectus are in Africa, and the oldest fossils of Homo sapiens are in Africa. So depending on where along that line you establish that's where humans are, it is Africa, and more than likely East Africa, but that's where we have the evidence from. We have very little evidence from Central and West Africa due to the nature of the landscape and civil war, quite frankly. We can't get in there. Okay, and I suppose one point I do make in the course, which I quite like to make at this stage, is that even though we don't know where humans evolved, it was somewhere in Africa. Around, I think it's 70,000 years ago, there was a bottleneck in human evolution. And scientists think that we were down to somewhere in the hundreds, possibly, of humans, and that they lived in the Western Cape. So whether or not humans originated in South Africa, everybody is related to someone from the Western Cape, and so everyone can call the Western Cape home, and that's something we can be quite proud of. No more people, please. We don't have for what. Well, over by Mossel Bay, they might be all right. Okay, just before we go on, I'm aware that Hlengiwe has walked in, and so just give you a quick chance to introduce yourself. We're already a little way in. And Hlengiwe, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do? And then one of the students asked what you think science is. So a little bit, what does science mean to you? Okay. Yeah, I can speak here and you can hear me, right? Yes, the microphone is here, so you have to speak up that side. I should have done it the other way, really. I have the loudest voice.
I'm Hlengiwe Radebe. I'm currently a project coordinator at Sustainable Energy Africa, an NGO based in Cape Town. We work with local government, assisting them in developing strategies and policies around sustainable energy and renewable energy, really. my key focus in the past 3 years has been around energy access in South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So I've been working with local cities, Cape Town, Polokwane, and some Sub-Saharan municipalities around how they can increase energy access to households and more, so that it's more affordable to the households as well, and households can move into more cleaner energies. I've been part of Access since the 2011 or 2012 or something like that. Yeah, so it's been a while since I've been part of the Access team. Yeah.
What's science to you?
What is science to me? Okay. Okay, it's okay. I guess it's for me, science gives me an understanding of my world, the world around me. Really, you know, I am a Christian. You know, there's religion, and I believe in that. But then also there is this life, yeah, that needs some explaining how we come about our human bodies, the climate that we live around us, and for me, that's where science comes to explain these things for me, particularly the area that I'm involved in, climate change area, renewable energy. That's where science starts to explain how we live as human beings, and also just gives us some level of control, really, because otherwise really will just overflow and do whatever we want. Really. Yeah.
Nice one. Thank you, Hlengiwe. That's really nice for two reasons. One, because I can introduce that we will be coming to sustainable development later. And then just moving back, we've just starting to introduce the evolution of humans. And the next section was a whole bunch of questions, which links to what you've just said, on the links between religion and evolution. So it's a nice segue into that. So we'll come later to the effects that humans have had, and that's where Hlengiwe will come in most of all. But right now, what we're doing is we're back to human evolution. And specifically, we had a lot of questions specifically asking about the evidence for human evolution and the links to religion. I'm going to try and go through them reasonably sequentially, starting with the evidence side. And so Sean Shezi asks, is evolution a science or a religion?
All right. So if we were to define religion as something that is faith-based, and science is something that we do, as Precious mentioned earlier, in a very particular process. We make observations, we define hypotheses, and we test those hypotheses. In that sense, evolution is certainly a science. It is not a religion, because that suggests that we take things on faith, and we do not do that. And one of the problems here generally with the public is that evolution is referred to as a theory, and people assume that that means that it's just an idea. But in reality, it's on the same level as when we're talking about plate tectonic theory. And what that means is we make observations. So observations have been made on living primates. Observations have been made as fossils that have come out of the ground. Observations have been made using genetic data, using all kinds of biomechanical data, et cetera, and we've developed hypotheses. And in many ways, we test those hypotheses in many ways. So if we look at a chimpanzee and we looked at humans, and we know if we look at the skeleton, what we see is that the difference is only by degree. So we make the hypothesis that these are generally very closely related. The genetics helps us test that hypothesis. So evolution follows every single step of the scientific method as any other science does.
Yeah, I think that's very important and very clearly stated. I'm just going to jump back 1 second. That Godfrey asks, isn't gender a social construct? And just to go back to that question, yes, I did point out that within the social sciences, gender is a social construct, whereas sex is your biological X, Y, X. However, within science, we actually tend to use them interchangeably as the same thing. So there's a little bit of a difference depending on what field you're working on. But you're absolutely right. Within social science, gender is just a social construct. I read the question to mean rather scientific sex. Okay, so back to human evolution. Unter Corso says, does the fossil record prove evolution, and how rapidly does evolution occur? So that's really, you've said firstly that it is a science, we look at the evidence. So I guess this is now getting to how strong is that evidence?
Right. So the evidence is incredibly strong. So if we accept evolutionary principles in terms of, for example, the products we get for medical science, we have antibiotics, we have viruses mutating for anti-drug resistance and that sort of thing. Those are exactly the same principles that we see being shown in the human fossil record, because we now, of course, also have other forms of technology like genetics. I'm sure many of you have heard of ancient DNA. And so the more evidence we gather, the more it is congruent with the theory of evolution. So we have yet to find evidence that is contrary to human evolution within the using the scientific method. So it's a very strong body of evidence, everything from genetics to radiometric dating to biomechanics to comparative biology to comparative primate anatomy. It's all there.
Yeah, then it would just take one thing to be wrong, right? And
yes.
We would revise the theory.
Of course, and that is the beauty of science, which is very different to other forms of knowing, like faith-based knowing, is that it is always open to contradiction. If you find new evidence, you must change your mind. And as yet, we haven't found anything to change our minds about that.
Which is, yeah, it's really interesting.
As yet.
Which will link into the next question. But nonetheless, it's getting on for 200 years since Charles Darwin first proposed the idea.
Yes.
And yet again and again, test after test.
Test after test after test.
It's getting, and it's always quite difficult with this because, you know, the one big example is obviously Newton's laws. And Newton's laws, we made them laws, not even a theory. They stood up for about 400 years. And then Einstein came along and did rewrite them. But that having been said, Newton's laws still are applicable on our time and space scales. Quantum theory and Einstein's gravity only really apply on very, very big scales. So it wasn't that they're completely redundant, but it is always an interesting one. But nonetheless, 200 years of rigorous testing, and so far, we haven't found any bit of evidence which contradicts evolution.
Yes, it's unfortunate, you know, you can't really call it a law because unlike gravity where everything falls down, evolution happens in so many myriad ways. It's very difficult to really pin it down and say, okay, that's the law of evolution. But everything evolves.
Everything living.
Everything living evolves. The Earth evolves in some ways.
So?
Changes over time.
And then we go back to last week's Gaia theory. But we'll move on. So I've got a whole bunch of questions which are specific to me, I think. Talisa Woji asks, Dr. Carl, what's your belief on evolution? Do you believe in the Bible? Nyambuso Mtetwa asks, does evolution mean the Bible is false? And Livawane asks, what is the HPW family's belief about humans, creation and evolution? So the first two are about the same. What's Carl or the program's belief? I mean, so firstly, in terms of the program, as you will have seen, we teach the current scientific understanding. It's a science program. It's not a religious program. So that's very clear. On a technicality, I can very quickly deal with the program. What's my belief, and does evolution mean the Bible is false? I will go a little bit more into. And I suppose, firstly, I should have probably answered the question as to what do I think science is. And I would say that science is a process which uses organized skepticism to achieve goals and to achieve things that work, to achieve progress. Progress is the word that I'm searching for. So the scientific method, which is the engine behind science, involves using empirical measurements of the world around us to test hypotheses. That's the first step. The second step is this peer review step, the idea of organized skepticism, never taking anything without testing it yourself first. And so when you do science, you make an observation, some empirical evidence about the world around you. You set up a hypothesis, you test it, you publish it, and then everyone else tries to find what's wrong with it, all of the experts in the field. And when you become a researcher, as I hope that many of you out there will do, this at first is very upsetting, right? Actually getting your first reviews back from reviewers, most people cry. I'm certainly sure I did. It's a horrible process. And it was incredible that we would do it. But as I will come to, we do it because it has a demonstrated, proven record of working, of driving progress, which no other system of thought does. So to the question of, do I believe in evolution? I think the question is badly worded, because there is no requirement of belief. Belief suggests that I have to take something on faith, or that I have to take something just told to me. But there's no need to believe in evolution, because the empirical evidence is overwhelming. There is no other hypothesis, no other theory that will explain the empirical evidence. So then if you believe that empirical evidence is a way to find out about the world, then naturally you have to believe in evolution. So that takes the question one back, and you could say, aha, Carl, well, I've pinned you down. You actually believe in empirical evidence. To which I would respond, no, I don't think there is a need to believe in empirical evidence because of this fact of progress. Because this scientific method says that an iPhone, like the one in my hand, will work, and it does, right? It says that this computer in front of me will work, and it does. It says cars will work. It says planes will work. This method has delivered incredible progress and proven without need for belief that this system of empirical evidence and organized skepticism works. So I don't think I do need to believe in it. I believe in empirical evidence because of the fact that it's delivered this progress. And I think if you want your cell phone to work and you're going to use your cell phone, you believe in it too. You believe that empirical evidence-driven science works. And if you believe that, then you have to believe that evolution is the only hypothesis right now, the only theory out right now that can explain the evidence around. Secondly, do I believe in the Bible? So, firstly, that is again a difficult question to answer, and I have to be more clear. Are you asking? I don't know. Are you asking? But I will outline two possibilities. Do I believe that the Bible is literally true? The answer to that question is no, and I have nearly every Christian on the planet on my side in answering no, including, for example, the Pope and the head of the Church of England, the two biggest Christian churches in the world. And I don't think you need evolution to show that the Bible isn't literally true. I mean, you can turn to page 1, and in page 1 of the Bible, God creates night and day before the sun. That's clearly not possible, okay? Because the sun is what makes night and day. Night and day happens on day 2, the sun happens on day 3. And in fact, how is it day 2 and 3? So immediately on page 1, you're already into factual contradictions. So most of the world's Christians do not think that the Bible is literal. And this came to a head, and it's a good story, so worth telling, a few hundred years ago at the trial of Galileo, a very, very famous scientist who pointed out that, contrary to the church's belief, again informed by the Bible, that the sun does not go around the earth and that the earth goes around the sun. The Pope at the time was so furious by this that he put Galileo in prison and put him on trial for blasphemy. And at his trial, Galileo said something very, very important, which I reiterate again and again at Habitable Planet, because I think it's still very, very important today. And that's, he said, the Bible tells you how to go to heaven and not how the heavens go. And what Galileo has done is he separated two types of problem, which we'll deal with next week on the course. Ethical problems are those about morality, about how you should live your life. And that's what the Bible, Galileo argues, is about. It's a book telling you how you should live your life. Scientific problems, how the heavens go, how the world works, is the area of science. Science tells you about how the heavens go. And Galileo's point is to take a book that was written about ethics, how you live your life, and try and read from it information about how the world works is a mistake. You're misusing the resource that you've been given. And what I go on next week to point out, which is equally important, is that believing that science tells you about ethics is just as big a mistake. And so for me, Christians who read the Bible literally and there's a lot of them still, are making a mistake that they're misusing the resource. They're actually using a book that was written about ethics to try and learn about science. But equally as bad, lots of scientists in the field of conservation and climate change think that science tells you about ethics. They think that because their species is going extinct, that means we should do something about it. And I think both are equally misled. Okay, that was a long monologue, but I think they're important questions. Has anybody got anything to add? Hlengiwe as the professed Christian.
There was one question in there that asked, so there were two things. There was, do scientists try to prove what is in the Bible? And my response to that was, I agree with everything Dr. Kyle said, so no. But also there are 7.6 billion people in the world and only 32% are Christian. So in my opinion, the purpose of science is not to support any one belief structure, but to understand how the world works and why for the benefit of all of humanity. So that is my understanding of what the purpose of science is. And there was another question, which was, well, if people talk about being made in the image of God, and how does evolution tie in with that? My counter question to that is, if we accept that we were made in the image of God, what does God look like? And I think if you asked 1,000 people, you would get 1,000 different variations on what God looks like. So what does that say for our understanding of what that image is?
That's very true. Also, the Bible's quite specific that man and women were both made in the image of God. So he would be an interesting person to look at. Nobody's ever had a look, so it would be difficult to know. Okay. Are you still with us there, KZN? Give me a thumbs up, someone on camera. Yay, excellent. Good to know. We'll be coming to you soon, don't worry. Okay, so I'm going to move on from the religion and science and the basis of evolution. A second section of questions that lots of you were very interested about is the link between evolution and how different races arose, and particularly skin colors. So Viwe Paya asked, what led to the origin of different human skin colors?
All right. So first, to understand, so one of the things that we have to understand, I come back to what I said right at the beginning, is that all evolution happens in a population. And in every population, if you look at a group of people in any one little town somewhere, or excluding people moving all over the world, if we go back to some indigenous populations, you'll see that every individual in that group does not look identical to any other individual in the group. That's what we call variation. And we accept this variation within our families, within our communities. So skin color is like any other physical trait variation. It's like the fact that some people are taller than other people. Some people's nose shapes are different to other people's. It's all part of physical trait variation. So it's not special in any way. And the reason why it's so variable, even within one family, is because skin tone, skin color, is what we call a continuous quantitative trait. And what that means is that it exists on a spectrum. It doesn't exist as a single, this is black, this is white, this is brown. It's a spectrum, a continuous spectrum, because it's controlled by many different genes. But the main gene is the one that determines how much melanin you produce. And if you produce more melanin, you have darker skin, and if you produce less melanin, you have lighter skin. And now this melanin production is actually an adaptation to UV radiation. So skin color is very simply geographic adaptation to the local UV radiation. And why this is important is because when you have people living in tropical climates or around the equator, so low latitudes, we have a lot of UV radiation. And what you need there is dark skin to be able to resist cancer and also to protect what we call foliate. Foliate is a very important thing that women have in their bodies, and it helps maintain healthy pregnancies. Now, when you live in high latitudes where you have low UV radiation, what happens is you need to let the sunlight in. And the reason for that is because we also need vitamin D. And the vitamin D is very important, particularly when you're developing, when a child is developing for strong bone growth. So these two things, not having too much UV and not having enough UV, are the things that counterbalance, that creates this adaptation to the UV radiation that creates what we see, a direct correlation between skin tone and latitude. So that's the first thing. So that is all skin tone is. That is all skin color is. Now, what's the second question was?
Shall I actually maybe just go to Noe? Because she asked why, if you've got that, so there's this correlation.
All right.
But then, so Noe asks, why don't white people, such as myself, I've been in South Africa 10 years, if it's just a response to the amount of radiation, why aren't I black?
Okay, so again, remember, evolution, adaptation is a form of evolution, happens within population. So it has to be an entire population over long periods of time that are staying in one place and being exposed to those climatic and environmental variables in order to force that selection pressure for the dark skin. Now, that being said, if all light-skinned people who lived in equatorial regions lived in a gene flow vacuum, so they only had babies with each other, they walked around naked and didn't wear any sunscreen, more people would get cancer and fewer would have babies. And that is what we call evolutionary fitness, or lack thereof. So they wouldn't be very fit. So what would happen, given those very particular variables, is that light-skinned people would actually go extinct in equatorial or in low latitudes, or they would, as a population, eventually, because there would be some slightly darker skinned people within that population who live longer and have more babies, and so over time, hundreds of generations, they would actually get darker skinned.
Perfect, yeah. So it's the difference between genotype and phenotype as well, right? Yep. So the genes are driving it. You can't change your genes once you're born. No. Although, you know, I have got a little bit darker since. So there is some sort of phenotypical
what people
response.
don't realize is actually every single person has the same number of melanocytes. We just produce a different amount of melanin.
Yeah, very interesting. Emmanuel asks, so in that case, were black people the first inhabitants of the earth?
Sorry, Carl, can I quickly go back to the race question, or do we want to come back to that?
Sure.
Okay, so just to finish off the topic of skin tone, it's very important to recognize, like gender, race is a social construct. So skin color is real, it's biologically determined, but it is also continuous throughout the world. So I'm going to take Indian people. So I am of Indian descent. And in Indian people, in that community of Indian people, there are light-skinned people as light-skinned as many white people in South Africa. Within Indians, there are people as dark-skinned as any black person in South Africa. So where do you draw the line? Race is an artificial construct. It's created to put people into categories, and unfortunately has been used to oppress a lot of people for a long time. So it's extremely artificial.
Okay, very, very important to make.
Yep.
Can I move to black people, first inhabitants of the earth? So with the proviso that obviously it's a social construct and they probably wouldn't have identified as such.
No, they wouldn't have identified as black Africans, no. So that's an interesting question, because if we assume that for our ape ancestor, we had traits that were chimpanzees actually. So what we actually believe is that as we started to lose our hair, or the hairy bodies, we had a evolution. It was happening at the same time. The more hair we lost, the darker skin was being selected for. So again, it was a continuous thing that happened over time. So somebody didn't just stand up one day, lose all their hair, and be a pale-skinned person walking around on the planet. Hair was gradually lost, and skin got gradually darker in Africa.
I know that the reasons for us losing our hair are a subject of much controversy, right? People don't really know. And there's a whole bunch that are now thought of as a little bit eccentric that think it was from swimming.
Oh, so this is something we call the aquatic ape theory. The aquatic ape theory suggests that, and it's wrong to call it a theory, the aquatic ape hypothesis. It's an idea that is an idea that people have, in that they suggest that hairlessness and large brains are a result of living close to the ocean. In that we were swimming and we were eating a lot of seafood, which led to larger brains. So that's about as much as I know about aquatic ape hypothesis.
Another interesting bit of evidence for it is that it's only humans and aquatic mammals that have a layer of fat under the skin.
Yeah, so it might very well be that it's all about thermal regulation. And then that's pretty much what we've come to understand about hair loss, and it's largely due to both to thermal regulation, because the less hair you have, the cooler you stay, and in Africa that's really important. Remember, there's all kinds of things happening in the body at the same time, standing on two legs, etc., etc. So all parts of thermal regulation. And yeah, the layer of fat probably just keeps you warm and keeps you going longer. We are the ultimate marathon runners, after all.
Okay. A couple of quick questions from online. I'll have to push you to do them quickly, as we're nearly through our time.
Okay.
Subon Kakonke, long name, principally asks, okay, so Carl made the point about science producing things that are useful, like the phone. It says, so is evolution useful?
Is evolution useful?
Like the theory, knowing...
Well, do you ever use antibiotics? If you ever use antibiotics, if you ever use any kind of medical service, then yes, the theory of evolution is very important. It's also important in terms of understanding what may happen with us in the future.
Okay, nice one. There's a whole bunch of questions around our relationship with apes. I'm going to skip through those in the interest of time and because it was covered in the course. And so the last really big set of questions on evolution looked at it as an ongoing process. And so there's a whole bunch of them really that all sort of fall into that same one. So I'll generalize it as to, is evolution still going? And if so, where would, particularly with reference to humans, where would we expect it to go?
All right. So this is a difficult. It's not. Well, it isn't. It isn't. This is all about. This is an opinion. So what I'm going to tell you is going to be an educated guess. So in terms of what we understand about a lot of what drives evolutionary, the big evolutionary steps in human evolution, there are two major factors. There are external forces like climate and environment that push selection, like I talked about the skin color variation. There are other things that drive perhaps bipedalism, like we think at about 3.4 million years ago when the earth is drying out, we've got this push, selective pressure for bipedalism. So that's the one thing. And the other thing, that main big factor in evolution, is something called genetic drift, which is that populations become isolated for long periods of time and they adapt or evolve independently of each other. So modern culture takes both those things away. It takes away genetic isolation because we move all over the world. So we're adding variation all the time all over the world, and populations don't necessarily become isolated long enough to produce new adaptive responses to things. And the second is we've taken a lot of this environmental selection pressure away from ourselves. We, if we don't have water, we have technology to bring in water. If it gets cold, we put on clothes. If it gets hot, we put on an air conditioner. So we've taken a lot of the selection pressure away. So it's very difficult to predict where, if any, evolution will continue to happen. One thing, it's a small thing, but that the statistics bear that our jaws have in fact been getting smaller still through time, and that's why a lot of people have impacted third molars, because we've gotten smaller jaws in the last couple of thousands of years because we eat more processed foods. So there's no selection. People don't get abscesses and die.
And no wisdom teeth.
Yes, exactly.
But I struggle with that, because has anyone died before puberty because of their wisdom teeth? No, it doesn't happen. I mean, you don't die because of your wisdom teeth, so you still reproduce. So what's the selective pressure against wisdom teeth? It doesn't add up to me.
Well,
to have selective pressure, right?
Yeah.
It's got to be something that makes you die before puberty and not reproduce. But wisdom teeth doesn't. You go to the doctor, you get them taken out.
So why would it disappear?
Exactly.
Because there's no positive selection for it anymore as well. So there's positive selection and there's neutral.
But evolution is clear on that, right? You don't need to have any positive of it. If for example, hairstyle of humans, it has never really had a big impact. So lots of different styles exist because none of them are a disadvantage. The big thing, to get rid of something, it needs to kill you before hitting puberty. That's the only way that evolution can get driven. Otherwise, I suppose.
Well, I guess it depends on how many people 1,000 years ago were having.
That's true.
Babies
maybe
before they were.
But now maybe it stopped,
20.
right? So maybe 1,000 years ago, kids with wisdom teeth might die because of the complications.
Whereas now they don't.
Now they don't.
So they continue to reproduce, and the allelic frequencies change over time.
So, but would that mean that if principally we've got to a point where we cure childhood disease, which we have in the Western world near enough, then evolution stops?
In humans?
In humans specifically.
I don't know, because there's new diseases evolving all the time.
That's true, I suppose. Okay.
And we don't know what the climate's going to do if our technology can keep up.
That's also very true. I have to press on. Just very quickly, Viwe Sam asks, what led to the Neanderthals going extinct?
Okay, so this is one of those things that has changed dramatically in terms of our thinking. This is a great example of how evolution allows for new evidence to change your ideas. When I was an undergrad, we were learned that the Neanderthals were outcompeted, were basically driven to extinction through warfare and through disease. And what we now know is actually Neanderthal genes exist in many populations around the world. So what we think now is that Neanderthals didn't necessarily go extinct, they got absorbed into modern human populations.
Okay, very interesting. And I read at one point, right, that they think that maybe ginger haired genes come from Neanderthals.
Yes, yep.
So I always thought they were odd. Now I've got some
now
proof.
you know why.
Some very quick ones to finish off that section, and then I promise to the others we'll move on.
Yes.
Livawani asks, would it be wrong to say that Khoisan people are proof of Homo habilis? Yes, very wrong. in fact, racist.
Yes, very.
Very important.
Khoisan people are fully modern, culturally, behaviorally modern people.
Yes, and a similar question from Sindile. All of the human groups that we know of are all Homo sapiens, and the idea that some are less developed than others was one that was put about in the last century by a lot of racist ideologies and deserves being left behind in the last century. One from Simonello asks, if we're all related, why don't we look the same? I contest that we don't look the same, and I have a few statistical tests to show you. I'm going to use the panel in this room just to illustrate. If we count the number of ears each panel member has, I've got 2, 2, 2, 2, right? Very rarely in biology will you get a standard deviation of 0 within your sample set. That is quite remarkably similar. If I go to eyes, 2, 2, 2, 2. Again, 2 results with a standard deviation of none. That is incredible. Now you could say, okay, humans have lots of things in pairs, so I'll go with noses. 1, 1, 1, 1. This is an incredible amount of similarity. But there's a thing from an idea from the social sciences called habitus. And that's the things that you see every day that have just become normal to you and that you don't notice them. So I would argue that it's an example of that. Human beings are so incredibly similar to one another that we've evolved for thousands of years to try and focus on the differences, because you have to be able to tell them apart, right? But if an alien came down who has 16 heads and 24 body parts, etc., they'd look at those humans and go, well, they all look the same. How can I possibly tell them apart? They've all got 2 eyes, 2 ears. So my answer would be, yes, we do look the same.
Just quickly, so just what you're asking is why do I look different to Carl? And in terms of our genetic ancestry, that's all geographic variation. It's all climate adaptation from the original populations that we stem from.
in Mossel Bay.
In Mossel.
Okay, I'm going to move on from human evolution. That was the vast majority of your questions, so the next sections will hopefully get through a little bit more quickly. The next lecture was on the problems of human population, and I'm going to head over to PMB to Noabisa to just give us a little bit of a flavour of why that's important in a habitable planet. I hope you're still awake there, Noabisa.
I am.
Hey. Go ahead.
So a quick summary of a quick summary of the human population talk in the habitable planet story is that we all know that humans now introduced into the world, and we are sort of growing. The number of humans are growing quite rapidly, and we are impact on the earth, mostly negative impacts, but we do through technology and other things have somewhat in terms of the earth. So yeah, I think this is the quick summary of what the human population is about. It's just about how, as much as we have grown on the earth as humans,
We appear to have lost Noabisa. I don't know if everyone else has or if just we have. This machine is a bit slow because it's on the wireless, whereas that one should be better, but that one
It's also lost.
Noabisa, can you hear us? Appear to have completely lost KZN. KZN, if you can hear us, you need to work on getting your signal back. I'll carry on so long, so let me just see. We'll have to go on with just Cape Town for now until we get KZN back. So basically, human population presents us with a big problem. The world, as we saw in the talk, oh, wrong mouse. As we saw in the talk, we used to have a situation where most human societies had extremely high birth rates and extremely high death rates. And when the industrial and agricultural revolutions came along with modern medicine, we've got to a point where we can control disease to such a point that death rates have come down, and the population went through an exponential growth phase. One thing that's very rarely pointed out and is worth mentioning is that we're at the end of that exponential growth phase. Most countries have got to the point now where birth rates are starting to come down. Many countries in the Western world have got to a point where they actually have negative population growth. So the highest point, the inflection point of the exponential phase has been passed. But nonetheless, this brings a whole bunch of problems with pressure on resources. But Sithelele asks, are human beings a resource? And that's a really, really interesting question. And Noabisa might have something to say on that. But for now, I'm just going to say that that is, in fact, the topic of the next lecture on the course. So I'm going to leave that for next week. Zamavuzo asks, are there any ways that you might be working to decrease the population? How much effect do you think a decrease in population would have on the greenhouse effect? And so the question asks, are there any ways that you might be working to decrease the population? I mean, I can personally report that I have no children so far. So, I mean, I have done my bits as things stand. I suppose you might mean genuinely scientists. I know that there was a conservation organization in the US some years ago who decided to stop spending money on conserving species and spend it all on handing out free condoms. As they did the calculations, and they decided that actually they would save more animals, they would save more species from extinction by just making fewer humans. And that does seem to be a very tested way of reducing the footprint of humans on the earth. And of course, every less person is a less person taking flight, driving cars, etc. So that would have a big impact on the problem of climate change as a first approximation. But again, I invite you to wait until next week's talks. I'm trying to find questions that don't involve KZN, and in fact, we've got a couple are we coming on? But it's going to come on to climate change. All of the rest on human population are coming to KZN. Okay, I'll just do those ones and then we'll move on if we don't have them back. Nokutula Mhlongo asks, will the Earth be able to handle as many people as time goes by and population increases? And very similar questions from Salilwe and Mudao, asking what will happen if the birth rate isn't controlled. And again, I'm going to very, very quickly go over those. I mean, number one is, I mean, the population is, as I say, the rate of growth is reducing. We have passed the maximum rate of growth, both in terms of numbers and in terms of gradient. Excuse me, in terms of percentage, I mean. So the human population isn't going up as fast as it was, but it is still heading to level out somewhere between 9 and 12 billion, which does appear, with current technologies, to be too many people. But as we'll come on to again next week, every one person added to the planet takes resources, but they also have the potential to be someone who invents something, to be somebody who makes something more efficient, to be somebody who makes resources last longer. So there's an interesting question as to what the value of adding one human being to the planet is. Is it a negative value? Does it take resources from the planet? Or is it a positive value? And I'll present next week some interesting discussions on which way that goes. And so I'll leave that for then. We're going to come back to human population when we get KZN back. For now, I'm going to move on to climate change and hand over to Hlengiwe. If you could just give us like a couple of words, why is climate change important?
Okay, so most of my answers are going to be answered not just as an academic, because I'm not in the academic space. I'm not going to come and say that I know. So I'm going to answer them based on my current work. If there are some unforced, I'll leave Carl to correct me on that.
Also, you are something of a specialist because you did at Habitable Planet give the talk on climate change.
Yes. So for me, what is climate change is we look at, as we have been saying, that things that have been changing for the past years. Over the years, things have been changing, and that's what we look at when you look at climate change. For me, is that over the 100 years ago, we compare what climate was, and there's evidence that shows that there was a different climate what it was to today's to what we're experiencing now. Also, just even most of us, I'm guessing people are listening around about above 20. So we've lived about for 20 years to 30 years. And then there's the exceptions of Carl, who have lived longer than the rest of us. So there's some that, so we all have seen that. So if you have noticed, we also start to notice that actually our climate has also just become a little bit more different than when we were born to what we see today as well. So that's for me is what you see, even like the biodiversity around like plants as well. You're starting to see that there's differences as well. There are just even the plants, the way even what you expect in terms of day-to-day weather and seasons. Also, you're starting to see that there's differences as well. So for me, that's what climate change is as well. And then there's climate, and then there's the scientific part of it. That we're starting to see that the negative impacts of what compared to the past 100 years as well. Yeah.
And I mean, in the story of the Habitable Planet, to not try and preempt the questions too much, but it's important in the story of the Habitable Planet because, at least for us, it threatens to make it not habitable, right? That's the bare and naked truth. But I'm preempting a couple of questions a bit. We had two questions at the start, really sort of questioning the premise. So we had Fatima Diallo and Prince Jahidi. Fatima asks, some are under the impression that carbon dioxide is not a danger to climate change. Opinion. And Prince asks, anthropogenic climate change is nothing more than hysteria. How far is this statement true? I'm going to put those two, they're linked together. I'm going to start with Precious and then come to Hlengiwe to add.
Okay, as we've mentioned before, I think Carl and Riashna mentioned that science is, Carl used the word organized skepticism. So I think it's everyone has, if you provide evidence for what your argument is, then every scientist is bound to look into your evidence and actually question what you're saying. So I think there are people that actually provide evidence that carbon dioxide is not our main problem. Climate has been changing before then, and we've had higher levels of carbon dioxide compared to what we're actually experiencing now. But then what they fail to consider is that the rate at which we introduced the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere was not as high and disruptive as the rate at which it is being introduced into the atmosphere currently. And that is the problem. That's the problem that we have with climate change, is that the rate in which we're introducing this external forcing into the atmosphere is so rapid in such a way that our Earth system cannot balance it. And that's why we're having a problem of climate change.
Yeah, so also I guess to add that there's evidence. So there are people who say, okay, climate change is just some hoax to get people to be green or to be live a certain life. But then when you start to look at the evidence itself, the evidence that has been provided, you start to look at 100 years ago and look at, yes, so in the past we have had the only time that climate has actually changed drastically was because of a huge event that happened, and most of it happened like within a short space of time, like within probably like a day. A stone from the outer space came to Earth and then changed our climate. Whereas once we start to look now, what we are seeing is that we have been adding more and more of the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse. Yes, other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that were actually causing. We were starting to see that we are accelerating the climate change. So really, the question isn't really whether you believe it or don't believe it. Is what is the evidence provided to you? And also, like, if you're living in Cape Town, really, you start to think that actually climate change exists. When you don't have to bath in the morning, then you have to consider whether you're bathing or not, because you start to see that actually. In the past few years, or the past 10 or 15 years also of Cape Town, you start to see that they also just been changes. And also when you go back and say, okay, what's happening? And you start to realize it all goes back to what we've been doing to our own climate as well. We're increasing our carbon dioxide, changing overgrazing and cutting down of trees. Sorry, like I'm really getting this scientific. Cutting down of trees as well. So yeah, deforestation. Those things have accelerated climate change, and we're starting to see like some serious impacts now. We're starting to see it even now. So we can't really say whether you believe it or not, really, because there is evidence that is provided now.
So it's almost, it gets similar to the answer that we had with evolution, really. I mean, the evidence is just overwhelming, is your point. So whether you believe it or not, it doesn't really matter. It is what's happening. Okay, so your answer to those questions is yes, it's definitely happening. I'm just going to quickly catch up on the line. Just a couple of, one question is very quick. Daddy K says, we share a common ancestor, but we have different levels of melanin. What's the secret behind that? I suppose you could answer that with, I know lots of families where two of the children have different levels of melanin. They definitely share a common ancestor in their direct parents, and yet they already do. So that's not particularly difficult. There's one which is a really possibly difficult question, an interesting one, which we don't have time to address fully. But Simonesa asks, according to evolution, what's led to the development of consciousness? And is consciousness the different factor between Homo sapiens and other species? That's a whole field on its own.
That's a difficult one, because again, how do you define consciousness? If we define, scientists are working on many different areas in terms of how the brain works and how the human brain works and how that might be different to other animals. And quite frankly, what we found so far is that it's all a difference of degree. So if we call consciousness an awareness of self, then we know of other species that are aware of themselves. They have this ability to look in a mirror and identify themselves, but we do it to a much higher degree. If we think about consciousness as the ability to be kind to your neighbor, to your friend, in your community, lots of species practice altruism, where they can be good for the sake of the whole community rather than for their own benefit. So it's a very, very difficult one to understand. We do know that as soon as we've got the first technology being developed, we certainly have evidence of teaching and learning coming into the stone tool record. So the more complicated the stones become, the more evidence we have that people are not just imitating or doing something quite random. It's a learning process. It's cultural practice that's being passed on from one generation to the other. But we know that chimpanzees have culture. So it's a very difficult question to ask. And by far, the main conclusion that we've drawn from this kind of behavioral understanding of what it means to be human is we are human only in that we take everything to the next level. But the beginnings of it can be found in many other species.
Nice one, thank you. I'm aware that we have KZN back. I'm going to come to you just now. Motusi asks, do humans require a specific climate for survival? Precious?
I think humans are able to adapt to certain climates, and I think Riashna mentioned that evolution happened and climate change was part of the forcing. Mm-hmm. But then if the climate changes at a fast rate that we can adapt, mm-hmm. I think then we won't survive as a species, mm-hmm. as much as we've seen it happening with other plant species and stuff. So I think if we are able to adapt, but if climate changes in a rate which we cannot adapt to the climate change, then we will not survive.
Yeah, I've always thought it's more of an issue of poverty. I mean, lots of scientists point out, okay, sea level's going to rise, right? And so then Al Gore famously brings those maps with everywhere flooding. But Holland is like 2 meters below sea level. They've got loads of money. They just build a big wall. Bangladesh isn't just at sea level. It's higher than Holland. It gets flooded all the time. So I don't think. I mean, at some point, okay, you're going to get to a point where we could make ourselves extinct. But to a large extent, for what's predicted, it seems to me that it's a problem that poor people will die. Rich people will probably be quite all right. And actually, that very cynically, you could say that's why lots of rich oil company executives don't really care, right? Because there'll be winners and losers, and they're pretty sure their kids will be the winners. But I think it would be very difficult with the technology we've got to push us to a point where we'd go extinct, but we'd get very uncomfortable.
Well, I would say, so biologically, of course, there are critical thresholds within which we can live if we didn't have the technology to buffer us from these environmental factors. We can't live underwater, and we can live, only under certain water restrictions, etc., etc. However, climate change is only one way in which what I always say is the issue with climate change when it comes to the idea of human extinction is exactly that. It's not about the planet surviving. The planet will survive. The planet has undergone mass extinctions in the past. It has lost 95% of its species in the past. The planet will bounce back. It's all about our ability to live given the technologies we have for producing food and that kind of thing. And that might be where the problem is, really. It's our ability to still be able to have food, water, and all the basics, given the variations in climate.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, Adisa, do we have you now? Yes, we can hear you. Welcome back.
Thank you.
I'm aware that we're pushed for time, so I'm going to push you just 1 or 2 questions on human population while you're there. The one comes from Shepo, who asks, what are the chances of South Africa adopting a one-child policy like in China? only a problem.
Hello?
Did you get those questions?
I got the first one about South Africa adopting the one-child policy.
The second one is Pumzile's question. Is overpopulation only a problem where there's overpopulation?
Okay. I think there are very low chances, actually. South Africa is a very democratic country, and we know that it's got an awesome people quite a lot of rights. So I really, really doubt, based on that, ever adopt that type of policy. And I also don't think it can afford, for example, China in that policy, it pays for the kids that, if you have one child, then it's going to pay for your child's tuition and all of that. In South Africa, I don't think we can afford that. So yeah, I think there are very low chances for that happening. And in terms of overpopulation being a problem for only areas where there is overpopulation, I don't think so. Definitely we need to look at the world as interconnected, as we all said. We know that population, people move around, and overpopulation, whatever problems that come with overpopulation, like the increase in carbon dioxide and things like that, at the end of the day, the problems get sort of, they get spread out, kind of. So if people find that if I'm in an area where it's overpopulated, I might decide to move somewhere else. So then it's no longer a problem for that area, because wherever it is they choose to move to, it's going to be a problem for that area as well. So the answer is no. It's definitely not just a problem for that area.
It's a really interesting question as to how you define overpopulation. I often point out in the workshops that the country with the highest population density in the world is Holland, and they're very rich. The country with the lowest population density in the world is Namibia, and they're very poor. So it almost feels like there's an anti-correlation between density of population and how well off you are. So that kind of hints to the fact that the population of Holland are relying on a much larger area of the world than Holland, and thus any overpopulation problem is in fact a global problem, right? So Namibia is not overpopulated, but they're actually paying the price for overpopulation of other areas of the world, which is an interesting dynamic that we live in a globalized society. You good now, Abisa? Okay, good. We'll come back to us. Okay, we're going to move on to the solution. So we've had so far today, I don't want to look at myself, hang on, it's putting off. So far today, we've introduced humans into the system. So we had a model without humans, we've seen how the humans evolved, then we've gone on to talk about two of the biggest problems that humans have placed on the Earth system, the burden of the population, and then the problem of climate change specifically, which sits as one of the great challenges of our time. Next, we're going to look at the solutions. And Hlengiwe, can I impose upon you to give a quick summary of sustainable development? Colleen's not here, and it's not really one that I'm good on.
Oh, yeah.
I can do sustainable energy as one part of it.
Yeah, I don't know how to.
Or Kabir or Nawabisa? Anybody want to just give us a summary? Kabir?
Yes. We spoke about how we can deal with a lot of problems through technology. Human beings have caused, for example, whole human population and problems that we're causing. So sort of new ideas that help sort of solve the problems that we've already caused, and also the what is it called, renewable energy for electricity and things like that. So we're still trying to provide for the modern day, but also making sure that we don't deplete all the resources for future generations to come.
Oops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice one. Yeah, I think you got to the main message, right? Which is towards the end there. The sustainable development has this idea of meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. I find the definition problematic. And one concept I always give is, by that definition, coal power is very sustainable. For 200 years now, it's been meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. It might have got to the point where it's no longer sustainable, I guess, with climate change, but nonetheless, for 200 years it has been, that's surely 200 years is long enough to count something as sustainable, but of course it's not. Okay, so some student questions on the topic. Quena Mashilo asks, what would make it difficult for humans to try and imitate the life of our ancestors if it's the only way to save the planet? Riashna, you wanted...
Oh, wow. What would make it difficult? Largely just what we've gotten used to expect is, in terms of biologically, as biological organisms go, we are exactly what we were 50,000 years ago. So we could live in caves, we could go back to subsistence farming strategies and lower population sizes, but we would have to give up in order to maintain populations. With that kind of practice, we'd have to give up modern medicine and all kinds of things so that our death rates get higher and mortality becomes higher. People die at a younger age, for example. So it's really more of an ethical question than anything else, or a question of what we're willing to do.
I'll come in. I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding, though, which is quite important to highlight. I think it's Steven Pinker who points out that the best evidence we've got, it's a mistake to believe that pre-industrial societies were less environmentally destructive than post-industrial societies.
Oh, absolutely.
In fact, the converse is true.
Farming was incredibly devastating to landscapes.
Well, even before farming, I think hunter-gatherers were even more. The only difference is that there was
Very few of them.
And so the idea that going back to some pre-industrial way of life will help is of itself a misnomer. It's a red herring. It would actually make things worse because there's now more of us, and we've been going back to a way that's more environmentally destructive.
Possibly, yes. So, I mean, for example, we breed animals for consumption now, whereas we have evidence from 10,000 years ago where people were pushing entire herds of large animals, megafauna, over cliffs and then eating 2 or 3. So that was incredibly destructive. So yes, and
there's this idea that pre-industrial people sort of gambled around happily and lived in balance with the environment, and it's not true.
No, it's not.
And in fact, most of the time they went around murdering each other too, which also
well, we don't really have evidence for that necessarily.
Yeah, I'll give you a paper on it. Again, that's definitely Steven Pinker's work. He goes to look at pre-industrial uncontacted tribes and measures the rate of homicide within those tribes. And it's massively higher than Europe in the 20th century, including the Holocaust, the First World War, the Second World War, the Spanish Civil War. We think of the 20th century as being a murderous time. Pre-industrial tribes, with the evidence that we have, were more murderous.
Well, I'm not familiar with that.
I'll find it for you.
But what I can say is that in the fossil record, at least, we don't necessarily see huge amounts of evidence of trauma related to violence.
Is that true? I thought a lot of skulls have head injuries that could only be sustained by other humans.
It's a fallacy.
Okay,
yes.
That's interesting.
It's masochistic.
Okay, moving back to the present, Kabir in KZN there. Could you tell us a little bit, Tatenda Hove asks if deforestation is sustainable.
Sorry, so how does deforestation impact...
Sustainability, is it sustainable?
So we know forests cover around 30% of our world's land. And I see forests as being the green lungs of our planet. So if you cut back on our green lungs, it makes it difficult for you to breathe. So drivers of deforestation is agriculture, because we need to plant food to eat and to sustain all our people on Earth. Also urbanization, illegal logging, medicinal plants, and overexploitation. But things of deforestation affect sustainability is that keep soils moist. I mean, we only have 30%. So without the protection of forestry, our soils are going to run dry. You just change the whole ecosystem from having lots of plants and animals to having something like a shrubland or a desert. So without trees, this role can be quickly extinct. Just lastly is that critical role, as we know, in greenhouse gases. It balances between water sphere and then trapping the greenhouse gases. So without that, we're going to increase the speed of global warming as well as the severity. It regulates the global heat and cooling of the earth. And you know, the good thing is that, well, actually not the good thing, but global warming is something that happens over a century. So although it might not show, especially the oceans, they take quite a long time to respond to change. So even though we're doing something now, whether it's deforestation or anything, it might not necessarily impact us, but our future generations. So a small thing like forests could have a very big impact in our future.
Nice one. Thank you very much, Kabir. Let me just get us back. Sorry. Okay, we're nearly done, people. I'm aware that we're just a little bit over time, but we did start a little bit late, so I'm hoping we will be just about in the 90 minutes. Titus Shanika asks, us as scientists, are we really doing enough, particularly with regard to getting the word about climate change out there? Do you feel we are doing enough? I sense a lack of general urgency with the public, corporations and governments regarding implementation of climate change mitigation measures. I'm going to come to you, Kabir, for some comment, but first I'm going to ask Hlengiwe in the room here.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer on the basis of government, because that's what I've been working with a lot. One is that when you look at it, especially if you're on the outside, it looks like they're not doing anything. It looks like they're ignoring climate change. And most of the times, if you Google, you find that Trump doesn't believe in climate change and it doesn't want to put money into climate change. But as we speak right now, there are cities and mayors and national governments in Germany, as we speak, talking around climate change. COP23 is currently happening right now. So already there is the Paris Agreement, for example, within cities themselves who are on the ground with citizens already have Paris Agreement on how they can reduce climate change. In South Africa, for example, there's a project that my organization is working with local municipalities on writing strategies around how can they integrate climate change into their IDPs. So we will work with municipalities and get them to show step by step how they can start to look at the climate change issues. How can they integrate it into their IDP so that they can get budgets and start to address those issues. So we do that, and also we do like I think every 3 or 4 years we have this produce this booklet I don't know if it's a manual or rather called State of Energy, for example. And it also calculates greenhouse gases as well and looks at what are cities using. So we look at city of Cape Town, all the metros in South Africa, and some of the secondary cities, and some of the smaller towns as well. Look at what are they producing and look at how can they then start to, with their greenhouse gases, how can they start to reduce that? What are the options for them? For example, in the beginning, I said my area of expertise is energy access. So around that, to start to look at so households who are using wood for cooking and coal, how can you move them from those impactful sources to more cleaner energy sources such as renewable energy. So government is doing something, just that it often looks like they aren't doing something, also because they don't have budgets to communicate so much. So they just do it within themselves. They're not doing it to the best of their abilities because there are certain issues that are far more important, I guess, to them. The gender is more important, like poverty, alleviating poverty is more important, or education is more important. So that appears to be more important than climate change. But that isn't to say that it is not important. Yeah.
Nice one, thank you. Kabir, you want to comment from the point of scientists?
Well, I'm just going to give a little bit of my personal view very quickly.
Sure.
Yes. Adam Smith, who was a Scottish philosopher, and he always says that, global warming is a global issue, so that it has a more local level whereby change begins with an individual. And I believe that people are not doing enough. I mean, in his book, Adam Smith says that people are greedy, they are selfish, they always act in their own self-interest. And what's the thing is that, yes, while global corporations are doing what they want, but if there's something more pressing, like, for example, if we find oil here in South Africa or something like that, that would obviously now take precedence over everything else. So I think it's more like an environmental window dressing kind of a thing, whereby it's just about new technologies come out, we exploit more things, we make more profits and economics. That's just my understanding and what I think. But can be done, and there's a few people out there who really make the difference.
Nice one. Thank you, Kabir. Just one last question then before I'm going to move on to summing up. Mary Domini asks, if basically sustainable energy works and we stop producing CO2, are there not other factors that might contribute negatively to climate change? Precious?
Sorry, please.
If we stop producing CO2, if sustainable energy is introduced, we're all using wind, we're all using solar, are there other factors that would contribute negatively towards climate change?
So, like, the whole climate system is very dynamic. So evidence shows that we've had the climate changing way before we even introduced carbon dioxide into the system. So it will continue changing, but then maybe the rate at which it changes and what will cause the change will be different. So to answer her question, yeah, there are other factors that can contribute to climate change, but not carbon dioxide per se.
Okay, nice one. Thank you. I've just remains for me, I'm going to have a look at the social media and see if there's anything interesting and very quickly go through the miscellaneous questions. Please talk louder. Okay, well, I'll do my best. Esther says, here, Dr. Kabir. You've obviously got a fan there, Kabir. So I think we're just about good for now. I'm just going to go on to the summing up questions as we are out of time. Zandile Ndaba says, is it true that new habitable planets have been found in the universe this week? Zandile, I would say that's what the headline said. But then if you read the results, they are planets that might be habitable. One of them does look extremely interesting, and I think it's like 95% the size of the Earth and just a little bit further out, so like a slightly colder Earth. But obviously, as we learned in Light and Air, the composition of the atmosphere has at least as big an impact as the distance from the sun. So that does look like one of the most likely contenders for a habitable planet that we've ever found, which is quite exciting, but nonetheless, it doesn't stop this one from being the only one that's known to be habitable still. Oh, thank you. That's, sorry, you're looking at KZN when you should be looking at us. Not that we're better than KZN just because we're talking. Umpo Mbedzi asks, why not increase the number of students going to the Cape Town workshop? And I will tell this with a bit of a little bit of a parable. That recently I discovered that my 14-year-old son had figured out that with his bank card, he can withdraw from my bank account. And I've quite happily continued withdrawing and withdrawing and withdrawing and buying anything that he wanted. Now I've found out he's returned to like the rest of us in the adult world where we can't have a magic card and keep withdrawing and withdrawing. And unfortunately with the Habitable Planet program, that's the same. I take as many students to Cape Town as I can afford. I have a budget, the Department of Science and Technology give me money, and I have to spend it as best I can. And I get lots of questions like that. And then another one I get is, why don't we have better accommodation? Why don't we have more food? Well, if you want better accommodation and more food, then less students have to come. And then people say, well, why are less students coming? It's a difficult balance to strike. Ultimately, what you need to do is write to the DST and ask them to give me more money. Particularly if your daddy is in government, get him to do it. Why do scientists, Nezengani asks, why do scientists say over 1 billion years ago? Well, we're still in 2017. Obviously, 2017 refers to what we now call the Common Era. That's the period after the historical Jesus Christ was born, they think, although it's a rough date. And obviously there's written history that happened before that, so it's not quite surprising that we talk about more than 2017 years. There's a written account, for example, of Julius Caesar invading my country, England, in 50 BC, 50 years before the start of 2017 years. So that's easily answered too. Very, very last question for the course for this year. So before I answer it, I think I'll just say a quick summing up that it's been really exciting to have such interesting scientists around. And it's been really exciting to have such excellent questions to answer and to interact with you guys. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in Cape Town. I'll give the others a chance to say bye just now, but I just want to put up a graphic to illustrate the question that's been asked, and it just takes me a little bit of technological wizardry right at the end here to share my screen. Just bear with me, and I have to do that one. The question that's been asked is it possible for humans to have qualities of a tardigrade, and how? And I'm going to answer that pictorially. I think the answer to that is definitely yes. How do I get my second slide down? There we go. I hope everybody can see that. The resemblance is striking. I mean, look at that mouth, eyes. I don't know if you can see my cursor. The mouth, the eyes, the nose. It is a significantly striking resemblance. So I think it is fair to conclude that we do have a human with qualities of a tardigrade. On that note, that's where we have to leave it. We're out of time. I'd like to say thank you very much to onto that camera, to our wonderful panel, both here in Cape Town. KZN, can you just say wave us a quick goodbye? That's this one.
Bye.
Thank you very much, KZN. And thank you very much, Cape Town. All of the scientists and former access students give up a large proportion of their afternoon to come and answer your questions, and I couldn't do it without them. So we all owe them a very big thank you. I hope you're all enjoying your food out there. We certainly will enjoy all the food because none of the Cape Town students turned up again. So we're going to now fill our faces. Thank you very much, guys. Bye.